Hello, everyone. I am Carl Mayton, and I'm just about to start this LCT roundtable. Is somebody want to tell me if the audio is working?
It is.
Thank you, Mauricio. So welcome to the LCT Centre online roundtable. This is season 2 of 2020, and this is, I think, our second of the season 2, or I'd say semester 2, but everyone's dates are now so different down here, and now we are reaching around the world to people in who's maybe in first semester, second semester, third trimester, who knows. So anyway, so season 2, this is a second one, and usual reminder from me that the Sentence Roundtable is intended to get your brain going, get you thinking, getting you discussing things. You can do so in the chat. You can also jump in and ask the question of the person who's running it. You don't have to wait to the end. You can always have an engagement with them at some point or whatever. So, I mean, it's supposed to be fairly flexible in its format, and it's supposed to go from the very kind of, it can be anything from very early in someone's research through to something completely developed. It may be practical, it may be theoretical. So it's very relaxed in that sense as to the way in which we do this. I, as usual, will just remind people of what's coming up, which is on October the 1st, which I think is 2 weeks. In 2 weeks' time, Jagen and I will, Jagen Doran will be leading it. We'll unleash the Kraken. Yes. Jagen will be unleashing or releasing the Kraken, or Kraken, I'm not even sure how to say that, of a set of ideas. And then on October the 22nd, so there'll be a 3-week gap, Kareem Wolf, and then there's Lee Rusniak, and then there's Jack Walton. So we've got lots of really exciting presenters from around the world to come. This week, right now, it's Susie Cowley Haselden. I hope I've said that right. And I am reminding you, Susie, to introduce yourself, because I have never introduced anyone for the roundtable, mainly because I find that, firstly, I don't like introductions, and secondly, I tend to find that people tend to read out, particularly at conferences. They can often just be reading out things that everyone's read in the bio of the person. So I think it's just leave it to you to decide what it is that you want to tell us about yourself. Over to you.
Thank you, Carl. I shall just do the usual fumbling around of sharing screen before I remember to introduce myself. Okay, so I'm hoping everybody can see the screen okay? Is that okay?
Yep, we can see the screen.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, I always get students to introduce themselves and then forget to introduce myself. So my name's Susie Cowley Haselden, and I work full-time at the University of Warwick. I'm the course director there for English for academic purposes, on the Warwick Foundation Studies. And I'm also a PhD student at Coventry University, sort of 5 years in, so quite a way in, although you probably wouldn't guess it from what I'm going to be showing you today. But so I'm going to be talking about knowledge building through academic reading circles, which is the primary concern of my PhD. Just to give a really quick overview, I'll talk a little bit more about my context, just so as you know where I'm coming from. I'll talk a little bit more about what academic reading circles are, or ARCs, as we tend to call them. I'll talk a little bit about my research design and talk through some data analysis and kind of conclusions at the moment. So I'm really glad of Carl's sort of outline of what a roundtable should be. I'm coming at this very much that I'd like discussion, so please chip in, comment. As I was talking to Steve and Daniel on Sunday morning, and Steve was like, oh yes, a coalition of minds, of the wonderful LCT minds, harking back to one of Mayton's articles. And this image here reminds me of those pictures taken at the LCT conferences of all those wonderful minds looking up. So please, I am approaching this as discussion rather than just sort of presentation, and I hope to sort of benefit from all of your insight. So this week there's no magic. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, but there is a connection to Jim Donahue. So Paul spoke last time about the influence of Jim Donahue, getting him using LCT in his work, and Jim Donahue's also been very influential in sort of my ethos in EAP, especially his work with Caroline Coffin. Where they sort of observed that academic behaviour, language and knowledge develop symbiotically. In EAP, we're quite good at sort of developing academic behaviour and language, but not so much about developing academic knowledge. So just, excuse me. So just to talk a little bit about my context, start low. I work in English for academic purposes. Now, that means that we prepare students or help students with English for the purposes of studying at university. Now, that may be sort of prior to undertaking their university courses, or it might be concurrently, so as they're studying their degree. And in the UK, we have two different terms for this. The development of English language and academic skills prior to undertaking a degree, we call a pre-sessional course. And that's what I'm talking about today, work on a pre-sessional course. Pre-sessional courses, students usually take them because they may meet the academic requirement for their degree studies, but they haven't yet met the English language requirement. So we often work with people for whom English is not their first language, and they need to satisfy language entry requirements for visa purposes. So these courses are really quite intense. For everyone involved, there's a lot of pressure. It's sort of a gatekeeper, if you like, for going on to academic studies. And so they're very intensive in nature, often sort of, they used to be potentially quite long, but they're getting shorter and shorter with, the whole sort of imposition of the neoliberal university, trying to get people through as quickly as possible, as many as possible. So they're often sort of 6 weeks, something like that. The one I'm talking about was a 6-week long pre-sessional course. Within EAP, we differentiate between English for general academic purposes, which is EGAP, and English for specific academic purposes. And the difference here is that it's really about who's in your classroom. So if you have a cohort of students and they're all going on to study the same degree or in a similar discipline, then we would call that, we're able then to sort of employ ESAP, English for specific academic purposes. However, if you have a group of students who are maybe going on to a mix of different degrees, and it's not possible then to sort of focus on one discipline area, we call that EGAP, English for general academic purposes. In the field, ESAP is often more valorised. We see that there's maybe greater benefit, greater purpose in being able to sort of prepare students more specifically for a discipline. The reasons for teaching English for general academic purposes usually sound a little bit more like excuses. It's down to budget and constraints and student numbers, rather than people actually sort of advocating that as a preferred way. But I think there's a lot of value in it, and I think people are increasingly seeing value in English for general academic purposes. And that's the context that I'm talking about today. I'm also the pre-sessional course program that my research took place in was focusing on postgraduates rather than the undergraduates. They were both on the course, but this research is focusing on postgraduates, primarily from the social sciences. So in EAP, quite a bit of knowledge blindness in various, it manifests itself in various ways. And I could talk for at length at the different ways that knowledge blindness exists in EAP. Not across all of it. There is knowledge of language, for example, is somewhat visible in EAP, and Letitia Mombeck's done some great work on that. However, although it's a South African context and talking about foundation programs, this quote from Luckett and Hunmer, where sort of bemoaning the curriculum for skills development at the expense of content, I think is quite fitting to the particular type of knowledge blindness in the EAP that I'm trying to address. The skills development that we do, or language development, that's based on text that we use, and I wouldn't say arbitrary. I think arbitrary is a bit strong in EAP, but the text is certainly a vehicle for something else. The text that we use is more, is more to sort of work for other purposes rather than to enjoy its content and to develop any kind of knowledge. So I think that's quite that kind of nicely sums up knowledge blindness in EAP for me. Excuse me. So the focus really is on reading in the work that I'm doing. So I think it's widely accepted that reading plays a fundamental role in success at university. But a lot of people sort of bemoan the fact that actually reading fails to receive the kind of level of research that in particular academic writing does. Although that's sort of starting to be addressed in research. And Reid has a really interesting article that she wrote about using reading retreats, so to sort of reformatting the writing retreat format and repurposing that for a reading retreat to afford space and time for reading as a communal activity, and that's a really interesting article. So reading is really important, but we don't actually research it enough, and that's really what I'm not trying to address that in its entirety, but I'm trying to contribute to, particularly in my field. Reading's really important in EAP. It's like I said, texts are everything. That's the basis of sort of what we use in the classroom. But in the field of EAP, just like in higher education more widely, reading is taught and researched as an adjunct to writing. So texts really are vehicles rather than receptacles. So by that I mean texts are used as an exemplar of how to write or discourse practice or to mine for vocabulary or whatever. but they're not actually used as receptacles of knowledge. They're not used to actually build knowledge of anything. So failing to focus on reading for knowledge building, I think, is sort of failing to adequately acculturate students into practices that are valorised in higher education, and that's really sort of the main purpose of EAP. So what knowledge to build is the question. The Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education in the UK, the QAA, have a document that outlines masters attributes, and they say that master students should develop the ability to convert theory into practice. There was also an article by Murray and Sharpling where they looked at lecturers' perceptions of what constitutes good masters level writing. That was quite a small scale study, but I think the findings replicate, certainly sort of anecdotally, what lecturers have said to me about this sort of linguistic accuracy not being such a concern, but actually content knowledge and structure. And for me, this is important, the ability to use theory without simply just regurgitating it. So this is sort of valorised in higher education settings, but it's not something that is generally addressed, I think, on pre-sessional courses, certainly not on the one that I was working on at the time. So my thinking was that this is something that needed to be addressed, and there's a lot of literature about reading being quite troublesome for students, and theorizing being quite troublesome for PGRs in particular. There's not much research actually about the troublesomeness of using theory at master's level. So I was interested in seeing if it was possible to develop what I've termed theory knowledgeability. So it's not just the ability to sort of use theory, but it's an understanding of what theory is, and also an understanding of a theory itself, I guess in a way of trying to scaffold that understanding of theory and how to apply it in practice. And a quote from a student on a pilot I did way back in 2015, it shows how troublesome the idea of using theory or being able to theorize is for students. So when she said that, I think we don't know what is theory, we can explain in a dictionary way, but when we talk about theory use, we're stuck. And it was this kind of feeling of stuckness that I wanted to try and alleviate for students. So before we go any further, I suppose I should really explain what academic reading circles are. They were developed by Tyson Seaburn, who in sort of 2016 had a book published about the model, but he had materials available online for quite a few years before then. So although this quote's from 2016, Tyson's been sort of advocating the use of ARCs for some time. So academic reading circles, it was basically, it's an intensive reading approach, and the idea is that through collaboration, students kind of achieve a deeper comprehension of a text than if they were just reading it at home. So the idea is that students are given a role. Students are also given a text to read, and before they come to the class or come to the discussion, they prepare this role. So the roles are discussion leader, and the discussion leader is expected to manage the discussion, make sure that everybody contributes, nobody dominates, and also then to think of some questions to develop the discussion. Another role is the summarizer, who is asked to bring a summary in their own words, although that tends not to happen, and bring a summary of the article to the discussion to sort of help the group with understanding the main points. There's a connector who is tasked with trying to identify connections from within that text, but to other things on the course, maybe lectures they've had, other readings they've done, or to something like that. The contextualizer is tasked with providing some kind of context to the article. Who wrote it? Why did they write it? You know, why was this text written? What was going on at the time? Although in my case, I think students tend to sort of focus on just the who wrote it part. There's a visualizer role where a student is asked to either find something online or develop their own visual that can map the structure of the text, or it could just be a few pictures that they feel represent the ideas in the text. And then there is a highlighter who is tasked with sort of picking out some key terms or possibly quotes that they think are quite interesting, or key ideas from the article. So the students prepare these roles at home, or maybe in class, depends how you do it. And then they come to class and they have a discussion. So
Susie?
Yeah?
Just to give you a break for a second, can I just ask, so they're always done in groups of 6, always, or do you, I mean, which one of these ones do you lose if you don't have 6 people in a group? Or if it's bigger than that, what do you do with the spare, the 5th wheels, as it were?
Yeah, that's a good question. So
it's a very practical question, but I was just, as a sort of like, I was just thinking, how would I run this? And also, can I also ask another question, which is, does it require a lot of explanation and modeling? I mean, do you kind of model through it first time and then have to spend quite a lot of time on that aspect of it before it sort of starts working smoothly?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll take that. I'll deal with that first, and then I'll come back to what do you do when you don't have 6 students. So yeah, it's like anything really. For it to work well, needs a bit of scaffolding. So what I've tended to do, so on the ARCs are increasingly used on pre-sessionals as an assessment, and that was certainly the case on the pre-sessional I worked on. So it was really important that students kind of had practice before just, you know, being expected to do this. So yeah, so in the materials, for example, we would look at sort of contextualizing a text and sort of tie that in quite a lot with sort of understanding about reliability and relevance, that sort of thing. But yeah, so through sort of sessions beforehand, so what should a discussion leader do? What kind of questions, you know, would are good to ask? So with other texts that you've used in class, you might focus on one of the roles and kind of develop it that way. So yeah, they do need a bit of hand holding, a bit of scaffolding first. Also, depending on how, so if you have a group of 12, for example, in an ideal situation, it may be that you would pair the discussion leaders together to prepare. So they're not doing it on their own, they can kind of talk to each other and share ideas. Also, getting what I've done before is, so each time that you would have an ARC, the roles would change, so that whoever was the discussion leader one week, that would pass to someone else the next time. So sort of getting people to talk to each other about their experiences of doing that role. So yeah, it's a little bit difficult to just throw them in, although I've been talking quite a lot to Steve Kirk and Daniel O'Sullivan, and Daniel came up with a really cool thing, actually, sort of putting in can-do statements with the roles, which I think would be really helpful for students. In terms of numbers, yeah, so I mean, obviously we don't always have classes that are divisible by 6. So the summarize, interestingly, so the way that I use it is based on how Tyson used to have it online sort of a few years ago, but he's since dropped the summarizer role, and I think that would be the one to go, because I think people tend to sort of do that anyway, and that certainly it seems to be the case. So summarizer could definitely go. Highlighter could also, everybody could do a little bit of that. I mean, you know, their choices of key terms or interesting vocabulary might be different. In terms of adding, so I have had, it was the case that I had a group of 7. There's a couple of options. You could duplicate a role, or what I did do is because none of these roles specifically ask for any criticality necessarily, I did add in an evaluator role. So that was one way around that. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, no, great.
Okay.
Oh,
So I
and
think
while I'm asking, while I'm here, Wendy Nielsen has asked, how do you choose texts for early work in an ARC?
how do you choose text for?
For early work, she said, in an ARC. If that's not clear, Wendy, maybe do you want to ask Jill?
I was just curious about the range of things, because you described that the groups are typically quite diverse, you know, people from lots of different backgrounds and ability levels. How do you choose text to focus on while you divide up into these different roles? You might be answering this already, or coming to this, sorry.
Well, I'm kind of coming around to my sort of way of doing that. Yeah. So this is the whole problem with sort of English for general academic purposes and English for specific academic purposes. You know, if you have that group and they're all going on to study, for example, I was just going to briefly talk about my previous experience using ARCs. I used to teach a group of postgraduate media and communication students, and they were all going on, actually this was in sessional, this was actually while they were studying their masters, and they had the same modules, so we could use the core reading from the modules, which they weren't doing until we started doing it in the EAP class. But yeah, so this is the question. So what do you do when you have a group of people, an engineer and a business person and an education person? So I'm going to get to that. Can I answer that in a little minute? The big reveal. So my previous experience with ARCs, so I've used them pretty much since about 2012, I think. And yes, I had this sort of, you know, perfect experience, idyllic experience with having a coherent group of students, and we could use their core reading, which I said they weren't doing before. Now, usually, I don't know if anybody's ever taught in a language classroom before, but often if you have a discussion question, you know, if you're doing your lesson plan and your timings, right, students discuss that, right, 5 to 7 minutes. It's usually, you know, discussions are usually quite short. But with the ARC model, half an hour tends to sort of be a minimum. So discussions do go on sort of 30, 45 minutes, depending. And students do get really engaged with it. So I've seen this really sort of positive experience in the classroom. However, my experience was then that I moved institution and I was faced with a classroom where I had students from multiple disciplines. And my answer to that, really, that text choice, was to try and think what would be useful for students across the board. Now, coming back to that kind of issue around content, sometimes the answer is to go for a generic text that people might find interesting. It might be about education in higher education. And that's kind of deemed relevant because students are going on to higher education. But that's not necessarily what they're going on to study and where their interest might lie. So I thought, well, given that students have problems with reading, but not just reading, but using theory, I wondered if it was possible to use the process to sort of scaffold that theory knowledgeability, scaffold an understanding of what theory is, and then an example of theory and practice. And the theory I chose for that was semiotic theory, because semiotics transcends all disciplines. So it's really about finding something that's interdisciplinary. to make it interesting or relevant or purposeful for the students. So my research questions, I wanted to see what happened when postgraduate pre-sessional students discuss theory. I just wanted to, seen that the model worked, and I wanted to understand a little bit more about that and really think about what was going on, particularly in terms of knowledge building. So I wanted to see, can this art process actually enable the acquisition of theory knowledgeability? So to talk a little bit about the research design. So the research is exploratory in nature. You know, I've seen this work and I wanted to kind of explore this a little bit more. So obviously it's a qualitative approach. The research took place in a post-92 UK university. Do you know, I don't know why I say that. Is it important? I'm not sure. But anyway, it did. That, I don't know, that might explain perhaps potentially why the previous institution I worked at was a red brick university, and it might explain then, you know, student numbers, postgraduate student numbers were much lower, and so there was a much more diverse cohort. Perhaps that's why that's relevant. In terms of participants,
sorry, Susie, I think it's I think it's extremely relevant. But then, I mean, my PhD was on British higher education. I think, you know, these people often, back when I was living in the UK, back when I was not, before I moved to Australia, people would often say in conferences that, oh no, we shouldn't distinguish these things, but they really have different cultures. So yeah, I think it makes a big difference, as you would have experienced in moving between a red brick from the 1920s and an ex-poly from, or ex-college from post 92. I mean, they have all sorts of, not just parameters of size and stuff, they just, you know, that culture, that sort of, and even down to the architectural layout of the place and what that affords, you know.
No, absolutely. You talk about architectural layout. The post 92 university I used to work at looked a lot like an NHS building, actually. But yeah, no, you're right. In terms, I mean, it certainly had an impact on. I mean, I was starting the idea for this research when I was at the Red Brick University, and it certainly had a huge impact on then how the research was going to be in the future. So yeah, it did have a huge impact. The participants, they were all going on to postgraduate studies, either pre-masters, masters, or there was in one group one PGR or PhD student. The discussions took place in 2017 and 2018, and I had two groups each summer. So we only had, there were 14 students in the first summer and 12 postgraduates in the second summer. So that 12 was worked out perfectly. Typically in the UK context, the students were predominantly Chinese, and quite a few Thai students, although there were students from Bangladesh and Cameroon and India and Iraq. So there was quite a range of nationalities. And so I decided to kind of scaffold that reading, that sort of theory knowledgeability, to have 4 ARC discussions. So previously when I've used ARC, it was, okay, let's talk about this text, and we'll have these roles. Next week, we'll swap the roles and we'll have a new text, and then we'll swap the roles and do a new text. So each ARC previously, when I'd used them, was a separate text. It was the same here. However, those 4 ARC discussions, although the texts were different, the whole design was to try and build that theory knowledgeability. What is theory? How is it used? And then to try and bring that together. And these discussions were video recorded and transcribed. So there were 3 texts. The 4th discussion didn't have a text. The first one was basically, like I said, what is theory? The second one was looking at semiotics and society. The third one was semiotics, and in the the subject area from the students' undergraduate degrees. And then the fourth ARC discussion, there was no text. The task was to kind of look back at the previous three and see where they'd kind of got to from there. And the semiotic theory it was really focused on in the semiotics article was that of Pearson, sorry. I should point out, this is really important, there's the role of content in EAP is quite contentious, and there's a lot of thought that we shouldn't get involved. It's not our place to get involved in developing academic knowledge. We're not experts in all the students' disciplines. We're language teachers, is quite often the thinking. So I wanted to just explore what happened when the students were on their own. Although I don't abide by that sort of thinking, I think we can develop academic knowledge in the classroom, in the EAP classroom. But I wanted to see what happened when there was no teacher involvement, to maybe then be able to alleviate those feelings of anxiety or uncertainty, or feeling a little bit that it's not our place. So yeah, so there's none of the discourse that's analysed, the discussions. I was not part of it whatsoever. It was purely what the students were doing. Students would come in the room, sit down and discuss, and then leave. I mentioned before as well that the pre-session was quite an intense experience, very stressful. So in our curriculum, what I did was we have each week we had sort of off curriculum sessions where teachers could sort of do whatever they wanted, what they thought their students needed. So I kind of stole those sessions to do this sort of intervention. So it didn't impact on students too much in terms of their time. I should also say that the ARC process, the ARC model, was used on the pre-sessional as well as an assessment. So the students were very familiar. A lot of that, so Carl said, you know, how do you prepare students for this? A lot of that had been done on the pre-sessional in the first couple of weeks. I didn't start doing these sort of theory knowledgeability ARC discussions until sort of week 3. So students were well trained by then. So analysing the discussions. I've used the dimension of semantics. Now I know we shouldn't assume that everybody knows what semantics is, but certainly in the EAP world, semantic gravity is the most, that people are the most familiar with it, I think, thanks to great work by Steve Kirk and Daniel O'Sullivan and Richard Ingold, where they've looked at semantic gravity in terms of academic writing. So I think there's a fair amount of people in the EAP community who are quite aware of semantic gravity, but semantic gravity refers to the degree of context dependence, excuse me, within practices. So it may be stronger or weaker along a continuum of strengths. The stronger the semantic gravity, the more that meaning is dependent on the context, and the less that meaning is related to the context means that semantic gravity is weakened. Alongside semantic gravity is semantic density, and these two often they kind of are together, but they can be analysed separately, and that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment. Semantic density talks about the condensation of meaning within practices. So again, along a continuum of strengths, semantic density is weaker or stronger, depending on whether more meanings are condensed within the practices or not. So together, they're kind of plotted on the semantic plane. For my purposes, for semantic gravity, the context is the text under discussion. So the relative strength or weakness of semantic gravity is dependent on how far the discussion is talking about the text and how far it might move beyond the text to broaden out the ideas within it. And then semantic density, the condensation of meanings. It's more about building the meaning across the discussion, about co-constructing some kind of meaning as the discussion goes on, or as the discussions go on, maybe I should say. So, as I mentioned, data was analysed using video recordings that I transcribed from, and the discussions were analysed more in moves, so it wasn't sort of individual turns, it wasn't clauses or sentences. In fact, I didn't punctuate the transcription, so it was more sort of looking at when part of what the participant said would kind of either move up or down in terms of semantic gravity. So there may be different sort of gradations within that one turn. And
Susie, can I just jump in there? Because I think that's really interesting, because some people are often asking me, some people have asked me, you know, what to almost to impose a unit of analysis that I find alien to whatever I'm doing. So I mean, people will say, oh, do you know, divide it up into clauses, or do you divide, I mean, like, good luck trying to figure out clause anyway, but do you divide it up into sentences, do you divide it up into whatevers? And a lot of the time, I mean, it depends on what your objective study is and what your data is, but a lot of the time, if I'm working with transcribed discussion or words as people speaking, or even printed, you know, writing, I'll just analyze until the strength changes or the code shifts or whatever it might be, which can be, you know, halfway through an arbitrary unit that wouldn't make sense to impose. It's, I mean, there may be cases in which, for example, when we're doing big data analysis using automated coding, it makes a lot of sense because we're going to analyze at that level and what that does. But for a lot of the time, it can just make sense to see what's going on with the text as it flows, because the aim here really is to analyze the shifting nature of the knowledge practices being expressed, rather than to understand the language, as it were, if that makes any sense.
Oh, completely. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. Yes, and that's because, you know, because transcribing, you know, you don't really know whether did the student intend that to be a full sentence, or did, you know, is that a question and listening to their intonation or whatever. So it's really difficult to be able to, you know, really be able to, like I said, punctuate what they're saying. So, you know, using that idea of just moves, just the shifts, I think really works. So as with most studies in LCT, that sort of LCT enabling that sort of those trips between theory and data, I'm still there, I'm kind of mid-journey. So these trips are continuing. But I'm going to talk a little bit about where I am so far. So my translation device at the moment, because I'm still sort of moving backwards and forwards, for semantic gravity, begins with, as I said, so the context is the text. So if everything is sort of grounded very much in the text, then that's showing stronger semantic gravity, and that then levitates to beyond the text if the discussion sort of leaves the text and starts to think about the ideas in other contexts. To then sort of split that up a little bit more, what I've seen in the data is that at the very bottom, I guess the strongest semantic gravity, although I'm coming to the, this is something I'd like to discuss with you all. So there's a lot of control in the discussion, and that often comes from the discussion leader. So the discussion leader, it's their job, decides whose turn it is, and therefore what is contributed to the discussion. So okay, and now I want the connector to tell us you know, what they found, or now I'd like the summarizer to summarize the article. Yeah, there's a question mark about whether this is the right place for that, but I'll come to that. Then there's simple reproduction of the text. So in the discussion, maybe participants quote directly from the text, or they might summarize the ideas from the text without often adding any of their own information to that. Moving slightly up to interpreting, which is when student and participants provide some kind of personal example, sort of to try and illustrate ideas from the text. Moving further up still to appraising, where participants offer an opinion on the text or perhaps other contributions within the discussion. Then generalizing, where participants maybe take ideas from the text and generalize them or relate them more to real life. Bridging is where participants then see that the context of the text under discussion, but they're then relating that to other contexts from other discussions that we've had. And I know Steve Kirk has a question about that, and he might be right, I'm not sure. And then abstracting, so taking the ideas and talking about them in more abstract terms. So that's the translation device I'm working with at the moment. To give you some examples from the data, here are some quotes from the discussions, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes to have a look at those while I have a sip of water.
So Susie, is abstracting where they explicitly bring in some kind of theory, or that is that just how it's come across in that particular quote?
Perhaps how that's come across in that particular quote, but it's more, I guess, where they talk about the concepts in the text, but in more abstract terms. So they're not ideas that are necessarily in the text, but then they're starting to talk about, well, what is theory and how is it used, and relating it to sort of more external contexts. I mean, if you have any comments as to whether that works or not, please, please.
So what's the difference between bridging and abstracting?
So with bridging, it's more that they're connecting to the text within that we've already talked about. So these quotes would have come not from the first discussion, but they'll have come from sort of subsequent discussions where they're like, okay, so this relates to what that text was saying, or this is an example of what we looked at last week. Although I think Steve Kirk would say that this is perhaps more semantic density.
Look, well, I mean, don't watch out, because the same examples, I mean, will have semantic density aspects to them, semantic gravity aspects to them always. You know, when you connect two things, there you are usually strengthening semantic density in some way, shape, or form, because you're relating stuff together. But at the same time, you may be shifting up with the semantic gravity. So, I mean, those things are, you know, on the same object of study and often in the same examples. So yeah, if it's connecting us, I mean, I'm thinking what you're saying here is that controlling is, can you go back one? Because
Yeah,
at least one person
this
missed
one.
the actual translation. So yeah, controlling is like very much in the space there. They're talking to each other about the things they're doing right then and there. You go first, you should have gone second or whatever. And then you've kind of got a shift, quantum shift up. Now that quantum shift from talking about themselves in that room or in that space, wherever it is on Zoom or whatever, and then talking about the text in different ways is a quantum leap up. And we would, in LCT, we could cover it in other ways with other dimensions probably, but you don't need to. For here, I think that makes sense to be like that's the most concrete, as it were. And then you've got a kind of like almost, it's almost like there's a bigger jump between there and the rest than between each one of the rests. And then, because they've shifted from the space they're talking in to the text, which could be, it's a different kind of context, as it were. And then you've got, so you're reproducing, interpreting, appraising, see, generalizing. So the only thing I think that people might be interested in just understanding a little bit the difference is generalizing, bridging, and abstracting, all which sound like they're connecting out to more context. So generalizing is, you just briefly tell us, generalizing, bridging, abstracting, what those three are would be awesome. It's a lot easier, by the way, I find, I don't know if you do this, but I always find it a lot easier to define semantic gravity from the strongest to the weakest. So it's easier to describe an articulation away or something being weaker. But that's personal.
Okay.
Anyway, if you just run us briefly through this, because I don't know how much more. You may have loads you want to get through, so don't let us sidetrack you too much.
Oh, no, that's all right. Yeah, so, like I said, controlling something that I'm going to come back to, because I've talked quite a bit to Daniel and Steve about this. I'm just not. It is a quantum leap. You're absolutely right, but it's really hard to know what to do with it. But I have some suggestions that I'd welcome thoughts on. In terms of generalizing, bridging, and abstracting, I mean, perhaps I'm kind of differentiating a little bit too finely here. But so what tends to happen in the discussions is that students will give, I guess, more general examples rather than personal examples of things. And they'll talk more generally about how, so for example, they talked about how, students learn theory at school, how I was going to say, sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. With semiotics, they were talking more about sort of in general how an understanding of signs can help in life. And I know that sort of saying that real life, that life kind of everyday kind of sounds like maybe it should be, semantic gravity should be strengthened, but I think it's because it's beyond the text, that it's outside of the text, that it's higher. So then connecting those ideas, bridging is the connecting across the text they've talked about, and then abstraction is more sort of seeing the ideas in terms of, I guess, more kind of as academic concepts, if you like, rather than relating them more to real life. I don't know, does that make sense?
It made sense to me, but may not. Just carry on. It's often in, and also remember, and people should always remember this. It's not about fetishizing the translation device. That's just a tool to be able to then make sense of your data. And sometimes things do shift around. I mean, the most recent one that I've been working on was, I didn't even intend to do it. So I was been analyzing, for a chapter, I've been analyzing some video animations and science explanations, and just couldn't remember what I was analyzing each thing and realized that I needed to, they were coming up recurrently. And so I started writing it down, and before I knew it, I'd made a translation device, and I had, oh shit, I didn't mean to do that. I certainly didn't sit there and go, I must do a translation device. It was because I was analyzing these things. I think, oh, I can't keep a handle on what's stronger and what's weaker in my head while I'm dealing with all this data. And so that's, it came from there. And of course, things got moved around. So, I mean, that's, and you're doing the right thing to discuss that with other people and see what they make sense of it, you know, and either discussing with it or even doing something like, I remember Helen Giorgio getting some colleagues of hers, some fellow PhD students of hers when she was doing her PhD, so it gave them a bit of data and said, what do you make of this? You know, do you think that's, and seeing if they had the same analysis as her. So it can often, just trying things out with people works a lot. Oh, absolutely. And Steve and Daniel know that data's coming their way very soon. so yeah, it's really, really useful. Yeah, thanks. Oops. So just then to kind of have a look at what that's starting to look like in terms of semantic gravity to start with. In the first arc where the students discussed the text saying, what is theory? Here are two profiles from two different groups from different years, color-coded according to strength of semantic gravity. Sorry for the slightly shabby waves, just trying to get Word to work for me. But it's interesting that across the four groups, there's a very similar pattern emerges. And this is quite typical of art discussions that I've had in the past, although I wasn't analysing them at the time. But you tend to see this pattern where so you have the discussion leader, and the discussion leader will ask for, like I said, you know, summarizer, can you give us your summary? Okay, thank you. Right, connector, can you give us what you have? Highlighter, can you tell us what you know about the vocabulary or whatever? So you see this sort of very low kind of up and down between discussion leader asking for contributions and students giving those contributions, and often they are quite dependent on the text, sort of reproducing the text, summarizing or quoting from the text, often regardless of what the role is. Excuse me. And then once that's stopped, once those turns have been taken and all of the roles have contributed, then there's this sort of shift where the discussion leader will often say, okay, so now let's discuss this, and they'll ask their questions, and that's when we start to see so I think in the second one, group 1 2018, the discussion leader asked something like, do you have any experience of theory or something like that? So they started to talk about personal examples there. So it sort of moved up a little bit. So yeah, so there's this kind of marked shift halfway through where things start to then become where students are talking about their own examples and ideas. Obviously there's no bridging here because there was nothing, this was the first discussion, there was nothing else to talk about. In the second article, Semiotics and Society, I think because of the nature of the article, so the article kind of provides a primer of semiotic theory, but then applies this to a lot of examples in society, and talks about things like teeth and hair, and talks a little bit about Wallenbach's mythologies as well. So then students had a lot of discussion around what things, what signs sort of signify for them in terms of their culture or their experience, and then relating that to more general general life, if you like. What's interesting though is that discussion questions are kind of used earlier on in these discussions. So students are performing different roles, so the roles have been reassigned. But this time students sort of seem to want to lead with a discussion question. Perhaps they didn't like that first experience of being quite sterile in a sense, very turn-taking. So discussion questions kind of come in quite early on. And there's no bridging again, although there's the opportunity to, students could relate this article back to the previous one.
but they tend not to do it. The third article, now what I should say about the third arc is that roles were removed here because students had a separate text each. That's another way, I guess, of dealing with what do you do when you have a group of students who are studying different things. So I guess you could take a concept, and students could read articles, of that concept in their discipline, which is kind of what happened here. The students were given articles that explored semiotics in relation to their undergraduate degree. I chose undergraduate degree because students would have knowledge of that, existing knowledge of that already. So what's interesting here, so the roles have been removed. There's no, because there's different texts, but what students did was they sort of self-enacted the roles. So in their turns, they would summarize and contextualize and highlight some key terms. And they would do all that themselves, although they tended not to use the visualizer role, apart from in one discussion, which is quite interesting. And then their discussion question would be very much kind of, what's your experience of this? Or do you have an example of this? So there's a lot of sort of the interpretation level, as discussion questions tended to ask sort of just for students' experiences, rather than anything more abstract. So these discussions sort of tend to bumble along at the lower level. Again, though, there's no bridging in the third arc, I should say. Well, apart from one example there. There's no, this is the third discussion, but there's still the opportunity for students to say, this is my text and this is how it connects to last week and the week before. So we still don't see that happening. It's not until the fourth discussion where students are not assigned any particular articles, but they're just asked to go, okay, well, let's just talk about what you've done and what's going on. That was kind of their remit. And then you see that somebody kind of takes on the discussion leader role. Somebody starts the discussion, a very brave person starts the discussion, and then it tends to sort of stay in the realms of weaker semantic gravity. And here there's a lot more bridging going on. So it's almost like without that fourth discussion, this may not have taken place. It seemed that it was, although there's that connector role, those connections weren't really being made in the previous discussions. So it's like they kind of needed that freedom, that space, that free discussion to just take on board and try and think about what they'd just done over the previous discussions. So problems. I did say there were problems. I don't know. I mean, one question I'd really like to throw out really is what people think about having controlling here. Like Carl said, there is a quantum shift. I'm not sure. One thought I've had is whether instead of plotting controlling as a sort of distinct level of semantic gravity, perhaps show that it's projecting in a way. So yes, it's control, but what they're actually doing is they're asking the students to abstract, or they're asking the students to generalize, or they're asking, so the fact that, sometimes it's just summarize, and nothing's happening really, although you could project that to reproducing. But there's a lot happening in that controlling, and I'm not sure it's really been captured yet, or whether maybe to sort of, if I use dots to plot, to maybe have a sort of dotted dot to show that the reason we're here, up here, down here, wherever, is because it's been asked of the people. So I'm not quite sure. I'd be really interested if there's any comments on this controlling.
I mean, do jump in, anybody, anytime. I mean, I'd just say, I mean, mostly it's about, for me, it would be like, what are you trying to show? And what are you getting out from the analysis so far that you think this would help to show? You know, like, I mean, for example, I mean, just, it'd be interesting to see what this would look like without the controlling bits connected up. So, you know, it would be much higher, not quite so many going up and downs, you know, and it would probably look like a kind of, I don't know which way around you'll see this, but there would almost be a kind of general N-shaped semantic wave through that one that you're looking at there in your slide. You know, kind of going, you get sort of like the first section being quite low, but then it goes high and then it goes not quite as low. I mean, you've still got that already, but I mean, it depends on what you're trying to show. What are you finding the semantic waves have been useful to see? And what do you think the controlling, which is a kind of stepping out of the discussion, it's almost a different kind of thing, really, in itself. I mean, I'm not suggesting you do, but I deal with, I'm finding it useful to deal with it with, when I'm doing with autonomy, I use it for that. But I mean, here you don't want to add in more concepts. So it is certainly the most semantic gravity, you know, the strongest semantic gravity, in my opinion. But, you know, you don't necessarily have to connect it up if unless it's going to show you something. So what kind of things do you find that it's showing you, or is it showing you that there's are the waves showing you that there's successful things going on in these, you know, these profiles, or which ones are better as worse as well? So I've kind of asked two questions there, which is one about the semantics, what semantics showing you here, and then secondly, which is a separate question, what might taking out the controlling or adding it in, or just leaving it there as a dot, not connecting it up or whatever, what might that show you? So there's two questions, really.
Yeah, I think the important thing is, for me, is that control is really dictating the shape of the wave. So it's the impact that it has on the direction of the discussion. Actually, so just reminded myself that Steve Kirk mentioned maybe sort of having a trajectory arrow as well. So sort of, you know, this, although they're controlling the discussion, they're kind of moving it up or moving it down. So I think it feels like it's important to kind of capture that.
Can I ask then, so I may have gotten this misunderstood, and please, anybody just jump in. There's loads of chat, by the way, and we'll, Paz and Mauricio will save that chat and share it with you, because there's lots of people having a good old chatter in the chat, which is almost impossible to actually, you know, makes it impossible to read and do the presenting at the same time.
Yeah.
But I mean, can you just then perhaps elaborate on what that controlling is doing? It's not, so there are very different kinds of controlling. Is that what you're saying? That it's not just a case of you go now, but now do this or now do that, which suggests that if that's the case, it might be that the controlling has its own kind of set of SG levels.
Mm.
If that makes any sense, that yes, it's controlling at the bottom about what's going on here, and it can almost be like but it has its, but it kind of like it's pointing to different, it may be down at the bottom, but it may be pointing to different levels, as you know, you said, Steve suggested, who's just missed the last 10 minutes apparently. He's because he's dealing with his daughter, but
how rude.
it might be that you know how you deal with that, I don't know, but it might be that are you saying that the controlling says now we need to do some abstracting or something like that, and not abstracting, but you know what I mean, now we need to connect it, is that right?
Well, I guess I kind of like the idea of actually controlling having its own set of SG levels. So there's different things, I guess. So there are times when I used to have in a previous sort of translation device this idea. It was I called it more administration, and it was sort of administration of topic or person. But I wasn't quite sure that was working. So there are times when it is sort of, right, it's your turn, you contribute, and it's very simple. But then there are times when I guess the discussion leader is sort of thinking, right, well, they don't say it as such, but it's like, right, that's the end of that. So now here's my discussion question, or now, can you tell us a little bit more about this? So I guess it's more through the questions that they're presenting to the group, and maybe that's something to distinguish. That then moves, you know, the trajectory of the discussion.
The thing is, what I would suggest doing, I mean, people can, as I said, please do just jump in, people, anybody. And I know that people are doing so in the chat, but I'll just remind everybody that Susie simply cannot do this presentation and read the chat at the same time.
No, I can't see anything
afterwards. But it might be that you do that only when you need to. So, for example, that if you had a section that you were writing about the role of the controller in these ARC things, in these academic reading circles, then that would be the point at which it's useful to talk about the way in which they are able to support moves up and down in the knowledge being expressed by the rest of the group, or not. So, I mean, in that case, it's valuable. You know, I'm always saying you only need as much theory as the problem demands, and it's also the question at that moment: does it need that? What can it be used for, as it were? You know, you don't have to do everything in one shot. You can do a kind of here's the main thing, and then. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about that separately, because now I want to talk about this. This other thing where this has its own role. So I'm going to open that up now and see what that's doing. By the way, Fiona's wants to say something. Fiona?
Yeah, well, Susie, I started wondering how much the nature of the controlling shifted across the 4 groups. So whether there's evidence that as your students got more familiar with being in these arcs, did they use the controlling role in different ways later on than in the beginning? I mean, I suppose I'm linking it to a question of whether your analysis of the semantics shows shifts overall, perhaps in how the students were using the groups to engage with the texts. I mean, and so there's multiple levels to that, because there's all the different roles. I mean, there's the overall goal of making them more confident in their reading and their dialogue with each other and with the text. But yeah, so I wondered if you analyze, say, the controlling role across time, across the groups, if you start to see evidence of them claiming what they were doing in the groups in different ways.
Yeah, no, I think that would be really interesting. I mean, one thing I should say, I suppose, is it's only in the first two discussions that there is an actual official discussion leader. The 3rd and 4th discussions, there are no roles assigned, although students sort of like I said, sort of self-enact them. So somebody starts those final 2 discussions a bit like the discussion leader has done in the previous ones. And I think if we go back to this, I mean, this is at the beginning, you can see that people sort of, and they're so nervous, they're so sort of unsure about how to start, that they do, there's very little control in this final discussion, as opposed to previous ones where there is a discussion leader present. Yeah, I mean, that's given me a lot to think about, actually. But I think that's something definitely to explore more. I'm conscious of the time.
I also know, Susie, I also want to let Namali want to ask a question.
Yes. Go ahead.
Hi, Susie. Yeah, just a quick question about, so maybe I missed this early on when you were describing the activity of setting up the ARCs, but do you actually not get involved throughout? Like as the teacher, do you set them up for these discussions and then you step back, or do you also have like, do you plot yourself on the semantic gravity wave as well, coming in as a controller, or moving the discussion where you want it to go? So I was just wondering how much control or how much influence you have on how the discussion is proceeding.
Yeah, zero actually. The way I've always done it is it was very, very conscious for this research. I wanted the EAP practitioner to not be part of it, just to see what happens with students developing knowledge without that teacher in part of it, for reasons that I said a bit about how we're sort of a little uncomfortable for engaging with subject knowledge or content knowledge or any academic knowledge really. But when I've done them before, just in my practice, I always just gave students space. It was their discussion. It was down to they've got a discussion leader. They don't need me. And when I've talked to teachers about it before, they've been nervous. They've been like, oh, what if they just stop? It doesn't happen. I've never had a discussion that sort of failed. Even students who haven't done their role or haven't prepared, they still contribute. They still ask questions. They still engage. So yeah, I just stay out of it. I'll talk very briefly about what I do afterwards, though. I think that's important. Not for research, but in general.
And then also, which student do you have any way of accounting for which student is contributing to which role at which point?
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah, you do. Okay.
Yeah.
Because presumably they'll jump out of their roles sometimes, especially as the discussion becomes more involved.
Yeah. Yeah. I did think about maybe sort of, I don't know, plotting roles or something like that. And then I thought, well, actually, it's not that easy because it's not always that person. So it's extracting the role from the person, if you like. But you're absolutely right. So there are times when actually other people do a better job of the role than the person who was assigned to do it. Yeah.
Thanks, Susie.
I think there's 2 raised hands. I'm not quite sure who that is though.
I can't see who they are either. So somebody. No, Thomas.
Yes, sorry. About the reading circles, these reading circles are a standalone activity, or are they along with, say, a lecture or other activities as well?
So for my research, standalone, but absolutely in sort of the EAP classroom or in the curriculum or on a pre-sessional, in conjunction with, and it doesn't have to be reading necessarily, you could always use a lecture or whatever. So very much integrated with the materials on the programme.
Fiona's still got her hand up, but I don't know if that's since before. Clearly. So carry on, Susie.
Okay. All right. So we've only sort of got 10 minutes left, haven't we? Or at least I have, because I have to take my daughter to school. So
yes, that's right.
But I'm just going to skip through something a little minute, and mentioning that idea of confidence. Alongside these discussions, part of the research design was that students kept a diary, and after each discussion, they wrote in that diary. The first time in my pilot, that was the disaster. They didn't get the kind of information I wanted. So I put in some questions for them to sort of try and frame what they put into their diaries, to try and focus them on kind of acknowledging whether they'd learned anything and how they felt about that, and what impact this may have on their future studies. And I think That's been analysed separately. I'm not going to go into that, but I've just extracted some quotes from those diaries that I think are really cool. So the first arc, you get this sense from some of the participants actually how excited they are about learning some new knowledge. I'm not sure that excited is often a word we would use with students very often on a pre-sessional. They're often very stressed and kind of focused on where they're going. But so for quite a few people, this kind of the fact that they were developing their knowledge, they found really exciting and were really pleased about. And also that they could understand better from each other and other roles, something, you know, things that are quite complex. The second arc, again, you know, obviously students were a bit confused, but then they felt that after the discussion, and they realized that they can answer questions or they can contribute, and that helps them feel like they've developed better understanding. Excuse me. Again, that these discussions help students develop a deeper understanding, which was exactly Tyson Seburn's kind of point of using these in the first place. But this idea of kind of creativity and cooperation and building understanding, working together. And actually that students realize that, hold on a minute, I can actually get knowledge from a discussion, which is kind of something they perhaps didn't appreciate they could do before. And I think because a lot of the time discussion is more kind of, you know, just what's your experience of this and what do you think of this, rather than actually giving them anything new. And then this final one, student at the beginning, well, not in the beginning, in the third arc, didn't feel very confident, felt a bit confused. But then in that final arc, again, felt excited because there was nothing to read. But actually started off confused, but then could see that actually they could make those connections and felt so much more confident about what they were going on to do at university. So really, really briefly, I just want to say that I know perhaps haven't evidenced it very well here, but it does seem that the ARC process can enable the acquisition of theory knowledgeability, and certainly in the analysis of the fourth discussion, I did want to show you an extract of one of those discussions, but unfortunately I've run out of time. It does increase confidence in students, which is really important, and that realization that co-construction is possible, but also that it's valid as well. In terms of teaching, and the role of the teacher, so I've completely taken the teacher out of the equation, but obviously the teacher is important in terms of the text selection to make sure that there is knowledge building potential in the texts that are chosen. What I have done after an ARC, so if I have sort of an hour and a half lesson, they'll do the ARC first, then we'll spend the rest of the time perhaps looking at the text in terms of how we would normally in EAP, in terms of genre features and discourse features and this, that and the other, or dealing with emergent language from the discussion, so maybe language areas that were proving problematic. So I'm sat there, I'm listening and I'm scribbling notes as students are discussing to then think about things we can talk about afterwards. The key thing really though is in the curriculum is sort of, if you read Reed's study, it's that time and space. It is so important, I think, to build in time and space for students to do this. And actually it could, you know, I use semiotic theory, but it could be used with anything as long as it's interdisciplinary for those sort of, you know, EGAP students. And a very, very final, I have to say quickly, a massive thank you to Steve Kirk, Daniel Sullivan and Letitia Monbeck for being my amazing support network. And there's my references. So I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, Susie. We do indeed, yeah, have some time for questions, and we'll also, as I said, Mauricio and or Paz will be saving the chat, so you can have a look at that as well. Just anybody, just jump in if they wish. Just reading the comments myself. A lot of people having to race off to go teach.
Yes. No, I can appreciate that. Shall I stop sharing and then maybe I can have a look too? Is it okay?
No, that's fine. Yeah. So, I mean, are you finding that semantic profiling is helping you to get a better sense of what may or may not work in these ARCs? In terms of getting them up towards theorizing?
Yeah, I definitely. I think, yeah, it's like anything, isn't it? You know, the power of hindsight. So yeah, as I'm looking at them, I'm thinking, oh well, that would have been good, or that might have helped, or maybe, you know, that should have happened, or perhaps there's another role that's missing that needs to go in there. So yeah, that's something I'm kind of at the back of my mind as I'm looking at them.
Thomas, did you have a point you want to make? Your hand went up.
Oh, sorry. Someone has been asked, some people have been asking in the chat about what software was used. We're assuming Word and Excel, but I just wanted to confirm.
I think that question was about your profile pictures.
Oh, yes. Word. Yeah, Word.
Okay. And the graphs were plotted with Excel?
No, Word.
Just Word, okay. It looks a lot like an Excel plot. That's why I asked.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. No. I find Excel just really, yeah. I'm all about looks, and it just looks too accountancy type. So yeah, Word.
I think personally, a couple of things that have come out from this is one of the key things in my mind anyway is that the controlling role or that aspect to it is something that's worth focusing in on in its capacity. You know, when someone handles that deftly, and its capacity to move people up and down and connect things and to be able to build. I mean, the aim isn't always to be up in theory. No, but to see that and to see whether how that works and how that supports things, which and I think that seems like a really key thing to get into because it is a kind of like a slightly different discourse and a slightly different role to the rest, all kind of inside a thing, and this seems to be more of a kind of directorial kind of aspect to it, sort of. You know, I would say meta, but you know what I mean. And to see how that kind of affects this ability to move up and down, and whether they're, and also to whether, I'm assuming also that you're just keeping an eye on whether when they go up, it's relevant. You know, like,
yes.
You know, I mean, like. One of the things that's kind of like a sort of like an add-on at the end of Semantic Waves, the original paper is saying there's a thing called semantic threshold. It does, you know, maybe it might matter whether you're actually accurate or not. It's not just a case of going up and down in waves. You may be going up and down in waves wholly inappropriately. So, I mean, there may be a little bit of that, although I don't think it's probably the most important thing. Is moving them up and down is probably the most important thing to get them out of just reading a text. I'm guessing. I'm not an EAP expert.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I mean, it's what was I going to say? Oh, sorry, I've been up since 4 o'clock this morning, so being able to hold a coherent thought is kind of beyond me at the moment.
Don't worry, just let it think. Just let yourself, you know, cogitate on that one.
In general, yeah, I will do. But in general terms, a lot of it is sort of relevant. There's no kind of weird stuff going on, but in terms of accuracy is another question.
Susie?
Yeah.
Lee asked a question in the chat. She asks, you may have already stated at the beginning, but are the students themselves aware of SG, and are they aware of the process on a metacognitive level? Are they doing the shifts intentionally, or are you analyzing what is happening without them aware of the goal?
So for this, no. For this research, no. But on the pre-sessional course, kind of. So they are kind of, but I don't connect the two. Like I said, it was just having those discussions and seeing what would happen. But I think in future practice, most definitely, like I was saying, Daniel was playing around with sort of mapping the roles to sort of different levels of gravity. So I think there's a lot to be done with that, yeah. But I didn't for this research. I just wanted to see what happened.
Well, Susie, I know that you've got to go. Parental duties call you on. Thank you so much for being part of our online roundtable season and connecting with other people around the planet in this fantastic community that is LCT. And it's so great that the EAP is beginning to sort of get that kind of movement upwards. I mean, and it's amazing. You'll reach a certain point. You keep going, discuss with other people, do talks, and then you get this point at which suddenly you will find there's a kind of critical mass, and it becomes this new thing, and you're suddenly a part of this wonderful community. And even in your sort of little field of your of EAP. I know it's a big field, but you know what I mean.
Yes, definitely.
And yeah, I know. And Daniel's saying you're working towards the critical mass. I know, and it's. I mean, but it is just. I'm just saying, keep at it, because there's this fantastic moment when suddenly it just kicks up a gear, and it's just amazing because we are better together, and as we are more than the sum of our parts. So thank you for joining, and thank you everybody for being a part of this. And I hope to see all of you in 2 weeks. Thank you, Mauricio and Paz, for sorting this out. And also, please save the chat so that we can send it to Susie and anybody else who wants to.
The chat has been saved.
Thank you, Mauricio.
For everyone, remember that in the LCT website, it's the information, you can find the information for the following roundtables.
Excellent. Okay, thanks everyone. And thank you, Susie, for being here. I hope everybody's there 2 weeks' time for Jagan and myself on epistemic semantic gravity, funnily enough. But not tools that you will want to use, Susie. Just keep going with what you're doing.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And before you go, by the way, Susie, where do you come from?
I'm Coventry, born but not bred. So Lincolnshire, Coventry, Midlands, really.
Right. I'm clearly losing the ability to be able to pin down accents.
Really? Why? What would you say?
Well, I hadn't got a clue, but I kept hearing certain intonations that reminded me of home. So, and I couldn't. So I think England is now becoming a kind of blob to me of all one thing compared to, because it's been so long ago that I lived there. So yeah, I was just thinking, oh, that sounds a little bit like I used to say that, or the people I grew up with said that. But no, I didn't grow up in Coventry or anywhere near Coventry. So.
No.
Or Lincolnshire.
Where did you grow up? Sorry?
Well, I didn't grow up anywhere near Coventry or Lincolnshire or anywhere around there. Yeah. So I wouldn't have heard that accent. But having spent 5 years living in Leicester and Stoke and places that aren't too far away. So,
okay. Anyway, right.
I'll let you go. Similar. Yeah, and thank you for doing that.
That's all right. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it was really useful for me anyway.
And keep in touch, and obviously keep in touch with your fabulous support network in EAP of Daniel, Letitia, and Steve, and so on. So, and you also might be interested in the brilliant group hosted out of WITS by Lirushniak, who are pretty much in your timeline, so time frame. Yeah. Sort of. Sorry, I've had virtually no sleep for 2 nights. So in your time zone, that's the words I was
right. Yeah.
In your pretty much in the same time zone as you. So
which is good. Good news.
Yeah. We'll be sending out more information about that soon.
Okay. All right.
Right. Thank you, Susie.
Much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Maurizio, you can stop the recording, shall we? And
yep.